The church felt like a place that had learned to hold its breath. Every step I took sank into a fog of hush and expectation, like walking through a room where someone had opened a window and let winter wash everything still. My shoes made a soft sound on the floor that could have been a heartbeat or the echo of someone else's. She was there before I reached the front, a black shape under a thin veil, eyes burning from somewhere inside the cloth. Her face was a carved thing, grief and fury braided together into something new. I had not wanted this. I had told myself I would not come. But the world has a way of dragging you to the scene of its own making, and so I walked across the doors I had not wanted to cross. A sister's voice cut the quiet like a thrown stone, quick and unforgiving. Accusation landed in the pews with the weight of a verdict. The room shifted, and I felt the whole congregation turn as if we were the planets and everyone had been waiting to see which way I would tilt. Words rose inside me, apologies that smelled of smoke, explanations that would fall apart. I swallowed them. I had learned once that defending yourself in a room full of pain is like trying to douse a house fire with your hands. The ember always finds flesh. Then the priest called my name. The syllables felt like a trapdoor opening under my feet. He held a thin envelope between his fingers, pale as bone. My name was written across it in a hand I knew too well. The sight of that looping script made my knees want to forget how to hold me up. Inside the church, my life folded back on itself. We were young once in a careless way, careless as only lovers who do not yet know the arithmetic of loss can be. He had been the quiet center of my chaos, the place I went when the world made too much noise. We had loved in the slow, braced way of people who think time is an ally. Then everything narrowed. He became an iceberg I could not warm. He learned silence and hid storms under a polite face. I learned how to apologize to the air. I opened the letter because I could not open it. I owed him that much, and the rest of it was a curiosity I did not know I would have to survive. His words were a map of abandonment. They did not say he loved me anymore. They were not tender. They were a ledger of things left unpaid, moments when he had walked away and left a window open for grief to slip in, the taste of resentment hanging on his tongue like stale smoke. But in the margins, written small and jagged as if by someone who had rehearsed the motion 1,000 times, was something else entirely. He wrote of secrets, of voices in halls that were not his, of hands closing doors, of poison disguised as care. He apologized for being gone, but he also spoke of people who had smiles like gloves, polite, soft, and hiding claws. Reading that, an ember became a coal. It was not only the pain of what he had written. It was the knowledge that he had known and had not told me sooner. It was the fury of being kept at the edge of his life, like a guest eavesdropping on a conversation meant for others. The grief in the room shifted under me and formed a platform. Grief burns into other things. For some it becomes quiet. For me it became a plan. I left the church with the letter folded in my pocket and the world asking me a question I did not yet have the language to answer. The weather outside was indifferent. That was the first thing I noticed, how the sky would not be complicit. People wanted stories with simple shapes, victim, villain, the tidy end. Life gives you textures instead. I took my hurt and sharpened it. I was not the kind of woman who believed in luck. I believed in leverage. I began to look at the people who had sat in those front rows and see them as levers waiting to be pulled. Their good faces, their quiet hands, the way they carried their respectability like armor. Each was a hinge. Elias's family had a secret kingdom. Investment meetings disguised as tea, whispered transfers of land, favors that arrived as if by miracle. They used pity like currency and whispered my name as if it were a stain. They were careful people who thought careful meant safe. They did not count on being studied. My first move was to learn what people thought they had hidden. I listened in places where eavesdropping felt accidental, hospital corridors, the hush of a charity luncheon, the warm, forgetting safety of a bar where the right wine loosened the right tongues. I learned the architecture of their lies, small betrayals built into legal papers, promises signed in the margins, the way a legal name could be folded into a trust and disappear from plain sight. I found the edges of their shadow world and I kept my hand on them. There is a terrible power in being underestimated. Everyone believed I would shrink, leave, disappear, take my shame and hide. They bet their future on my silence. They were wrong. Revenge is not only about vengeance. It is about making people see what they would not look at otherwise. I did not want to burn them in a way that destroyed everything. I wanted to remove the masks they so carefully glided behind. I wanted the town to shake when it understood that their charity had been a mask and their sanctimony a ledger. I started small and precise. I introduced ideas into conversations like seeds, the right question at the right time. A lawyer at a memorial coffee mentioned an obscure clause. A banker laughed about an unlikely donation. I taped my ears to those sounds, then learned where the echoes led. I teamed up with a woman who kept the accounts at a charity. She had a conscience that could be bought with truth. She had been waiting for someone to hand her the right file. People will move if you give them a reason that saves their own skin. I gave her that reason. Then I let the dominoes fall. Confidential letters arrived where they could not be ignored. Copy after copy was sent not to scandal newspapers, but to the people whose signatures were on the deeds and the trusts. The town newspapers printed dry, formal statements about audits. The church released a statement about stewardship and transparency. The polished faces of those who had pointed at me suddenly had to answer an accounting. Pride made them clumsy. Exposure made them human. They called me cold. They called me furious. They tried to smear me with rumors like painters blurring a portrait. But the facts were stubborn. Ledgers matched bank transfers, minutes matched decisions. One by one, the altars of their respectability were stripped. Meetings convened in haste. Offers were made to quiet the noise. A few of them tried to bargain with my silence, as if my shame could be bought with polite sums and a smile. I refused the bargaining. What I wanted was not money. I wanted reckoning. The sister who had stood like a judge at the front of the church found herself having to answer questions she had never expected to hear. The mother in the veil, the woman who had made her grief into an accusation, her world, built of well-placed prayers and carefully curated charity, began to leak. People she had helped quietly turned away when they saw the papers. Her fury gave way to a deeper thing, shame, the slow corrosive kind that eats into bones. There were moments when the cost of what I was doing pressed on me. Revenge is a mirror that does not always show you what you hope to see. There were nights when I stood in front of a sink and watched my reflection and wondered if I had become the thing I had sworn not to be. But then I thought of the letter, of the quiet admissions, of the years Elias had carried alone. I thought of how people used grief to build altars to themselves, and I told myself that truth was a medicine even when it tasted bitter. In the end, the town had to change its story. The funeral that had been intended as an elegy for one man became a reckoning for many. Contracts were rewritten. Directorships were relinquished. The mother and her allies lost their places at tables where they had once sipped tea and decided the fates of others. Not all of them were ruined. Some learned to live with a new light. Some retreated into private resentments that would never again be aired in polite company. When the dust settled, I walked by the church and felt a strange lightness. The letter had given me permission to stop pretending I did not know. It had given me a map not to vengeance in its rawest form, but to a certain kind of justice, public, shaming where necessary, corrective where possible. People asked me afterwards why I had done it. They wanted neat motives, a scene from a play. I told them, simply, that I had been left at the edge of a life, and that life had been folded into a set of lies. I wanted the lies to be named. There are those who will call what I did monstrous, and those who will call it necessary. I have tried to live with both names. Sometimes I wake and feel the old quiet ache. Sometimes I laugh in a way that is new. The last time I passed the church, a woman I did not know smiled at me like a conspirator. It was a small piece of payment. Not all revenge is a feast. Some of it is a single clean thing, the truth laid on the table and the people who hid behind piety having to look at their own hands. I put my fingertips in the pocket where the letter had once been, and, like the weather outside the day I left the funeral, the rest of my life went on indifferent, honest, and finally my own. I did not expect peace. Peace was never what this was about. What I found instead was clarity, the kind of sharpness that comes when you've cut away every lie and left only bone. For the first time in years, I could breathe without tasting bitterness at the back of my throat. But revenge has a way of echoing. Whispers began to move through the town. Some called me ruthless, others brave. There were those who said I had saved them, dragged into light the quiet thefts and betrayals that had hurt them too. And there were those who swore I had destroyed a family, that I had trampled grief with spite. Both stories lived in the same streets, carried by the same voices. I stopped caring which version reached me. One evening, as the sun burned low, Zara, Elias's sister, found me outside the market. Her eyes no longer had the sharp rage they had in the church. They carried something heavier now, something almost tired. She walked up to me, her jaw clenched, as if she had rehearsed the meeting. "You wanted to destroy us," she said. "No," I answered. "You did that yourselves." I just took away the curtains. For a moment, silence stretched. I thought she might strike me, or spit, or scream. But instead, she dropped her gaze and walked past, leaving me with nothing but the sound of her footsteps fading. That was when I realized revenge is not a single act. It lingers, not in me but in the ones who tried to bury me under their guilt. I had left them with mirrors they could not cover. That was enough. Weeks turned into months. The scandal settled like dust after a storm, but dust never disappears, it just waits to be noticed again. Their reputations never fully recovered. Their names still carried weight, but now it was a weight people whispered about, not lifted in praise. As for me, I kept moving forward. Some doors opened that had once been shut. People who had judged me before now offered help, opportunities, even friendship. But I learned to be careful. I trusted no easy smiles, no sudden kindness. Betrayal had taught me that people will cloak their hunger in generosity. And yet, something softer grew inside me too. Not forgiveness. That word still felt like poison, but release. The day came when I stopped measuring my life by what Elias's family had done to me. I stopped thinking of them as shadows looming over every choice. My revenge had already carved its mark. I didn't need to keep feeding it. Still, on quiet nights, I take out that letter. The paper is worn now, the ink faded in places, but Elias's words remain. They remind me of where I came from, of the storm I walked through, and of the fire I carried with me to burn away the masks. It is strange his final gift was not love, not apology, but the truth that made me sharper. He gave me the weapon I didn't know I had been waiting for. And with it, I became something new. Not just Naomi Rivers, the woman they tried to bury and blame. But Naomi Rivers, the woman who turned grief into judgment, who made silence speak, who refused to be erased. That is my story. Not a love story. Not a tragedy. A reckoning. And if they still whisper my name in church pews or behind heavy doors, let them. Every whisper is proof that they remember the day I stopped being their victim and became their consequence. There was a time after the uproar when the world around me felt smaller and clearer, as though the fog had finally burned off and I could see the map of my life without smudges. I kept busy in practical ways, sorting papers, answering questions, taking calls from people who wanted to mend fences or bury things deeper. But beneath the business was a new shape forming, slow and deliberate. I was learning what it meant to live in the quiet after a storm. My mother came to see me one afternoon with a knitted shawl and the uneasy softness of someone who has watched too many of her children learn from their own scars. She had always been the kind of woman who preferred tidy endings, soup, apologies, a neat fold of cloth over the hurt. She sat on my kitchen stool and watched me as if I were a piece of pottery she had to turn over to see if any crack ran deeper than she could mend. "You look right," she said finally, and there was relief in her voice as though she had been waiting for permission to speak it. "Not happy, not whole, but right." I told her I was tired, and that was true. I was tired of pretending. I was tired of having to make my grief legible to people who preferred simple explanations. I was tired of the work it took to keep a life upright in a town that still taught people to polish the surface instead of cleaning the rot beneath. She reached for my hand and did not recoil when she found the calluses that come from steady work, from nights staring at paper and thought, and the small rituals that keep a person from unraveling. She did not ask whether what I had done was cruel. Mothers rarely talk about cruelty when there are reasons for it. Instead, she said something that would stay with me. "You forgot how to be small because you thought being small would keep you safe. Sometimes the world notices you more when you stop hiding." Part of me wanted to argue. Part of me wanted to confess that there had been a moment, a terrible, still moment, when I had felt like a hollow thing, hollowed by all the silence Elias had kept from me. But I didn't. Instead, I made tea and we listened to the clock together, an ordinary sound stitched into an ordinary afternoon. It was, I thought, the most ordinary peace I'd had in years. The fallout grew like vines, persistent and intrusive. Audits gave way to investigations. Seats on boards changed hands. A few people left town in the middle of the night with suitcases and silence. Some families fractured quietly as loyalties were tested. Others dug in their heels and paid legal fees to argue that their honor was unassailable. The town's rhythms adjusted. The market still opened each morning. The school bells still rang. Lovers still held hands on wet pavements. Life had an annoying ability to continue. Yet there were subtle shifts I could trace if I paid attention. The woman who ran the bakery stopped offering me the buttery biscuit she once reserved for her favored clients. A councilman who used to smile hollowly at my face now avoided eye contact in the market, his gaze skittering like a guilty thing. A charity gala I once would have been excluded from now sent a perfunctory invitation with an envelope that had no name on it. These were small victories, petty perhaps, but they were proof the air had changed. There were also things revenge could not fix. Elias did not come back, and nothing I had done could stitch him into the fabric of a life again. There was no undoing the years of quiet that had sat between us like an unopened book. The letter had been his last honest thing, and that honesty had its own price. I would carry the knowledge of what he had known, and of the silence he had kept, like a coin in my pocket, always there, occasionally heavy. One winter evening I found Zara on my doorstep. The exchange between us that day in the market had loosened something, or perhaps the pressure of the months had changed her. She stood there with a small parcel in her hands, a book wrapped in plain paper, and for the first time since the funeral her face had lines that were not all anger. She looked older than I remembered, as if grief had been a pen that wrote itself into her skin. "I don't want your thanks," she said before I could make the common mistake of starting to speak. "Or your forgiveness." She hesitated, and the briefness of her pause made what she said next even sharper. "I want you to know what it felt like for us. The shame how it hangs. But I don't want to be the one who defines you." I understood then that whatever I had done, whatever I had exposed, had not simply punished them. It had forced them to reckon with ugliness they had refused to name. Some people grow softer when faced with truth, some grow harder. Zara had been softened, in places I could see in the way her shoulders lost some of their anger. There was no handshake. There was no reconciliation. Only a recognition, like two people who had both survived a contagion and now walked on the same street with different scars. Another woman, someone I had once thought of only as a secondary player in the town's theater, became an unlikely ally. She ran a small corner store and had seen more than her share of small cruelties. She brought me information sometimes, little scraps of truth that would later become a line of the ledger. She did not want credit. She wanted the satisfaction of unburdening. People who carry quiet guilt sometimes become the most honest informants because they have a hunger to make things right, even if just in a small way. It was not all strategy and cold accounts. There were small, unexpected joys, an afternoon of fierce laughter with a woman who had lost a father to the same family's indifference, an invitation to speak at a community group that wanted to talk about accountability. A late-night walk along the river where the water made no promises, but reflected the stars in a way that reminded me the world could still be beautiful. Once, on a whim, I attended a lecture on local history. The speaker romanticized the town's founding fathers and their great virtue. At the end, when questions were invited, I stood and asked about the parts the lecture had skipped, about laborers whose names no one remembered, about donations with strings attached. The room flinched at my voice. People who had learned to expect softness from me were unprepared for the plainness of my questions. But some in the audience nodded. I realized then that my revenge had not only cleaned one table, it had offered an example. Others would begin to ask different questions. I kept the letter, of course. I kept it not as a blade, but as a ledger of memory. Sometimes I read pieces of it aloud when the house felt too empty and the silence threatened to fill me with old imaginings. The words were not a comfort. They were a map of what had been. They allowed me to chart a path forward without pretending that the past could be erased. Years have a way of smoothing the edges of even deliberate actions. People who had once been quick with judgment grew older and, sometimes, kinder. Not all learned the lesson I hoped they would. Some remained obstinate, polished, and vengeful in their own fashions. But the town had shifted. Its story had acquired a different thread, one that acknowledged that piety without scrutiny can be a kind of violence. I remarried myself in small ways. I learned to enjoy my own company again, to cook a meal without thinking of who would praise it, to read books that had nothing to do with law or ledgers, to travel to a place where no one knew my name and therefore could not have expectations for it. I learned to fall asleep without cataloging the world like an accountant. Still, on certain nights, a dream woke me. In those dreams, I was back in the church, the pews rearranged into a courtroom, and all the faces that had once whispered my name were there, leaning forward with the bright hunger of an audience. In those dreams, I could feel Elias's breath by my ear like a memory that does not leave. I would wake with the taste of iron and the echo of his handwriting. One afternoon, years later, I got a letter with a foreign stamp. Elias's handwriting had been imitated, not copied. Whoever wrote it had been careful to mimic the slant of his R and the loop of his Y, but it was not his. Inside was a short note, a line about how people sometimes come back to reckon with their ghosts, and a small and signed photograph of a place I had never been. It was a reminder that echoes have echoes, that even when you think the world has settled, there are always voices finding new places to land. I do not know who sent that last note. I told myself it did not matter. The important thing was that I no longer needed anyone's validation to know the shape of my life. The town could whisper or shout, it could forgive or curse. My name belonged to me now, not to their verdict. There are days when I still pass the church and feel the old heat of accusation like a kind of forecast rain on the horizon. But those moments are brief. They pass like clouds. For the most part, my life is a smaller, truer thing. It is not perfect. It is not free of pain. But it is mine. Sometimes I think about the nature of justice. What is right in a world where people can be both sufferers and perpetrators, where charity can be both balm and bludgeon? The answer is never tidy. For me, justice was less about balancing scales and more about making an accurate map of what had happened, so that the people who had used grief as armor would be forced to look at their hands. That was enough. If anyone still expects melodrama, they will be disappointed. There are no grand public confessions, no dramatic courtroom collapses. Life rarely makes such clean scenes. The truth arrived in small, inevitable ways, audits that couldn't be hidden, friendships that fell away when the ledger was opened, small mercies when a neighbor finally said the words I had wanted to hear, "We were wrong." That was not a feast. It was a single clean thing. I keep going. I plant a small garden each spring and watch stubborn things grow, and in that watching I find a patient kind of satisfaction. Sometimes a neighbor brings over a jar of tomatoes. Sometimes a child runs past my gate laughing in the rain. Those are the quiet victories, the life I piece back together from honest work and stubborn attention. If people whisper my name, let them. Whispers are proof that a story remains in the world, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as a lesson, sometimes as a gossip to be enjoyed over tea. I have learned to live with the echoes and to live for the things that are unremarkable and real. When I tuck the letter back into its place, I do so with an odd gratitude. Not for the pain, not for the loss, but for the clarity it forced upon me. For the knowledge that when someone uses silence to build a house you were meant to live in, you can burn the curtains and let the light show the rot. You can demand that the house be repaired honestly, or you can leave and build something of your own. That is the last lesson he left me, perhaps without knowing he was leaving anything at all. Truth matters. Not because it undoes hurt, but because it forces a choice. People will either mend or they will hide. Either way, you will know them by what they choose. So I keep the garden. I keep the tea. I keep the small things that hold the quiet of a life well lived. I am careful with joy now because I know how fragile it can be. But I am also willing to accept it when it comes. And if the town ever needs reminding of the day it chose spectacle over compassion, or of the time it used grief as a currency, they will find the pages where the truth lives. I have no desire to publish them, to make a theater of suffering. I simply keep them neat, folded, private, so that on mornings when the world seems too comfortable with its own stories, I can open the drawer and remember the work it took to make things right. That is the end of what I will tell you for now. The rest is small lives lived without headline, a body that moves through the day with fewer knots, a mind that has learned to measure risk not by fear but by purpose. The letter sits in the drawer, and the house, imperfect and honest, is my own.